Today, the end goal is to be able to add a task to a to-do list. So for example, I would click the add task button and then type in something and then hit enter or click add, and then that task would be added. If I type in something and hit cancel, it doesn't get added. Same thing with the X button. So let me add another one just so you can see that the list will just get longer and longer and longer. So first thing we're going to do today is go to our app.js, and we're going to refactor our app component so that it can store data using what's called state. So we're going to make this function into a class. So just delete function, then we're going to delete the parentheses, and then we're going to say extends react.component. Okay, this makes it so we made components with functions before, and this is the way that you make components with classes. The component thing right here is imported there in the React. So the class that renders, the function that renders everything is the render function. So we have to wrap our whole return statement in that render function. Okay. Now when the app component is instantiated, when it's used, the constructor is called. So we're going to override the constructor method and provide our own. Super just initializes everything in the React component class that we're extending. So just include it. And then we have to initialize our state. State is where we keep all of our variables for our component. And we're just going to have a to-do variable that's going to be a list. So every time we make a new to-do item, it's going to get added to that list. All right. So our page should look the same still. The other thing we have to add is a handle create function. So this is when we create a to-do thing, we're going to pass it in this function as a value. And then for now, we'll just have the console print out what that value is, just for testing purposes. Later, we'll actually add it to our to-do component. Okay, so next thing to do is we're going to make a new file in components folder. We're going to call it tasks.js. And then we're going to set it up per usual, import React from React. And this is just going to be a function expression component. So we'll say const add task modal equals props, and then get your curly braces, and then we're going to return a React fragment that we'll add some stuff to in a minute. Then we're going to export add task modal. Okay, so a modal is a pop-up that allows you to add some information. So we're going to go to chakraui.com and find the modal component. So here's an example. I click open modal and it opens it up, then we can close it out. We're going to modify this so that we can add a task with the modal. So go ahead and copy most of the stuff in this basic usage one. Everything except the first and last line. I'm going to delete our return thing and paste what we just copied. Okay, now not everything in here has been imported. In fact, in modal body, we're just going to add a paragraph for now that says add task. And then up here we have to import many things. We could probably copy from here. So let's copy the import. We're going to also copy this, import this use disclosure hook. We'll go over what hooks are later. Just import it. And we also need to import button because button is being used. Okay, now let's add this component to our to-do page. Add Task Modal, and we have to import it. So import add Task Modal from components tasks. Got to remember the curly braces since we didn't use export default. We just used export. Okay, so when we click on open modal, it opens up our modal and we can exit out. All right, let's go back and modify this modal so that it lets us actually add a task. So for modal title, we're going to say add task. And then we're going to reorder these buttons. So select the first button all the way from its opening and closing tag, cut, and then paste underneath the secondary action button. Our secondary action button is now going to say cancel. And we're going to copy the on-click handler and put it in our button, cancel. And then instead of close for the main button, we're going to say add. And then we actually are going to want this to submit a form, so we're going to do type equals submit right in there. Now to add a field, so like a form field like this, where we can type in and then submit the form and add it to our page, go to Chakra UI and get a form control component. We're just going to copy the email address one and then edit it. So let's paste that inside of our modal body, indent it nice. And we're going to change it, get rid of the form helper text and get rid of where it says email. We're going to replace that with task across the board. And then in form label we'll say new task. And then aria described by, that's for accessibility purposes, it says what the input does. So we'll say add a task. Okay, now we have to make sure that we import form control, form label, and input up here. So just add it to our big old list. And you can organize this and make it look nice on your own. Okay, so now we have our buttons. We can type stuff in our new task field. Now we just have to make it function properly. So we need to add on submit function. We'll just call it submit form. And then it's going to take in the event that submits the form as the first argument. And then we're going to say event prevent default. That means we're not like actually submitting to a backend. We're preventing the page from reloading. Okay, and then we're going to close form. And in here we'll add something else in a minute. So what we're going to do is in our app.js, we're going to pass in this handle create function as a property to the to-do thing. So let's talk about state and props real quick. So a good way to make a React project is to set a global state on the app container where you store all your variables, which is what we've done. Our state is in our app. Okay? Then we pass pieces of the state down to children through props. Okay? And then later we'll talk about when you should have your own state in children components. But like it says, keep this to a minimum. So put most of your state in the app container so that it can be accessed by any other child of the app. So just as a reminder here, state is where we store variables. You can make changes to the state asynchronously using this .set state. I'll show you that in a little bit. And then props are read-only. So when I pass something through to a component, that component can only read it. It can't modify it unless it has some sort of handler that does that, which we'll do. So I'll explain this again at the end once you see the code, and we'll be okay. So in our to-do component here, we're going to pass the handle create prop in like this. Say this dot handle create dot bind parentheses this. There's a lot of thises. This refers to the class itself. So we're accessing the handle create function. And then when we say bind this, any changes we make in handle create to the state are going to affect the state itself. We just attach the state to our handler by using the bind function. So if that was a little bit confusing, don't worry about it. This is a hard concept for beginners. So as you use it more, you'll understand it better. Let's go to our pages. So now in our to-do function, we have props being passed in as a parameter. And we're going to pass in that same handle create function into here, which we can access using props.handle create. So this came from the app component. It got passed in through props, and now we're passing it one more time through to tasks. Here's a picture that kind of shows us that. So your global app component is going to have its state, and then it's going to pass props down to a component. That component might pass more props down to another component. Okay. So now in our add task modal, in here, we're going to say props.handle submit, and then we're going to get what the value was in our task input. So document.get element by ID, and then task. So it's going to pass that in. Oh, whoops. Handle create. That's what we called the function, right? Yeah, handle create. So props.handle create, document.get element by ID, task.value. So that's going to pass in whatever value is typed into task in the form and bring it all the way up to this handle create function where we're going to log it for now. Later we'll add it to the state. Okay, so to make sure our form submits, we actually have to, add a form. So let's add a form tag right before our modal body, and then close it right after modal footer. And then we'll say on submit for the form. It's so easy to add handlers in React. On submit, we're going to say submit form. That's the name of our form, our function. Okay, let's try it out. So what we should see, if we open this in a new tab and open up our console, when we open the modal, we can add a new task, and then it's going to log it in the console. Awesome. Okay, final step. So now in our app.js, we're actually going to add that value to our to-do array up here, our to-do list. So first thing to do is get the to-do from the state. So you do this by making a const variable to-do equals this dot state dot to-do. And then we can say to-do dot push, which is going to add that value. And then we're going to put, this is like a temporary variable. Now we're going to reset the state to be the new to-do list that we made in the temporary variable. So say this dot set state, and then you do curly braces and then to-do, because that's the name of the object. All right. Now we need to pass the to-do list from the state down into props. So say to-do this dot state dot to-do. We're going to pass it into our to-do component so we can actually display it. And then let's go to home pages, and we'll display all of our to-do things in a chakra list. So we'll say list. Have to import list and list item from Chakra UI. Okay, now you ready for this fancy thing? So we're going to say props dot to do, because that's what we passed it in over here. We called it to do in app.js. Props dot to do dot map. Map is a function that you can do on an array in JavaScript that will take each value in the array and then return something for that value. So in our case, we're going to be returning a list item for each value in the array using an arrow function. Okay, and in that list item, it's going to be the value. Okay, let's see if it works. Great, it's adding it to the list. Spelled it wrong, but whatever. And when you refresh, everything goes away because everything is stored in state. And state just stores variables in memory, just like any other JavaScript variable would. It goes away when you refresh the page. Okay, couple little styling tweaks here, and then we'll be done. So instead of open modal, let's have it say add task. So that's going to be back in our tasks.js. So let's change that. Instead of open modal, we'll say add task. And then for our list, let's add a little bit of props to the list so that it will look a little nicer. So let's just add a couple. We're going to say margin top equals 2. And then we'll say min width equals 400. These are all Chakra props. You can find them in Chakra by going to style props, and there's a whole bunch of them. Okay, so margin top equals 2, min width equals 400. You have to put brackets around stuff that's not a string, as you've noticed over here and here. Anything that's not a string, you got to put brackets around. Otherwise, you can put a string there, and you're good. Okay. Let's see what else. Then we'll say spacing equals 1. And then in our list item, we can actually hit enter here so that it's a little nicer to read. We're going to say padding equals 2. And then border equals 1 pixel. Border radius equals medium, and border color equals gray dot 200. And that should be enough for today. So we hit add task, new task, hello. There we go. It's gonna look pretty good. Okay, this will be available on GitHub. Link to that will be in the description. Have a wonderful day.